So the last time I really dove into the topic of loot boxes and the regulation that has been building against them was when Belgium officially banned the concept, which caused EA to pull back FIFA Ultimate Team from the entire country in order to conform to the new rules. At that time, I discussed how loot box revenue, particularly within FIFA, was a core section of the earnings roster for EA as a publisher, and how if this newfound legislation were to sweep across Europe, it would spell disaster for the industry titan. Well, very recently we got word that a US-based senator had introduced a bill which called for the banning of loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions in the United States. And as a result, quite predictably I might add, most of the creators in the space jumped on the topic and started raving about how big this moment is and what is to come because of it. Well, there was a time when I would have been right alongside them, but in the recent past I've started to learn a lot more about how this industry actually functions and what kind of decision-making process is considered when it comes to large topics such as this. First of all, it's important to understand what introducing a bill actually means. Introducing a bill in the United States is like a director walking into Disney to pitch a SpongeBob SquarePants Star Wars crossover movie. It basically means fuck all. When a bill is introduced, it goes through committee action, floor action, amendments, conference committees. It can be subjected to a veto, and depending on where the political chips fall, a completely reasonable and meaningful bill can be killed, morphed into some entirely unrecognizable piece of legislation through various additions and reworks, or suppressed into irrelevance. Now, I'm not an expert on United States government procedure, but to think that a bill being introduced means anything at this stage is absolutely idiotic. This may sound odd. I am, after all, someone who spoke of the possible demise EA would face in the wake of Belgium's official ban and the investigation that took place across over a dozen European countries, including Hawaii and Washington State as well in the US, but that is because the Belgium ban was an actual ban, and a dozen European countries investigating is a lot different than a US senator just proposing a bill. Here's where I need to clarify something. I despise loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions. Hell, I've practically built most of the channel at this stage on that very position. But government regulation, especially in the US, is a complex thing which isn't necessarily always a positive, even when the surface level goals align with player sentiment and expectation. A particular line of note is pay-to-win microtransactions in the bill. From what I can find, this is restricted to items that are made to feel compulsory or affect performance and gameplay flow. But the problem here is that as soon as you start drawing a hard line, there will inevitably be exceptions to that line that don't really apply. But in a literal sense, they do apply, which leads to quality games being harmed by the law. An example used in the bill and heavily discussed by various different articles covering it is Candy Crush. But Candy Crush features a heavy emphasis on time gating. When you lose games, you have to wait, and I do believe that there is a predatory algorithm that jacks up the difficulty on levels to spur purchases, but if you simply compare the idea of time gating to other games, you can see that a game like Warframe actually has some similarities that a piece of legislation might not be able to differentiate between. In Warframe, items and frames have crafting times. Those crafting times can be skipped with premium currency called platinum, thus allowing enough overlap for poorly designed regulation to prohibit the use of time gating and paired microtransaction sales, which would then effectively kill or at least severely handicap Warframe, which is a free-to-play game, but not really guilty of what any educated gamer would describe as predatory pay-to-win. On the contrary, Warframe has been held up by some as a quality example of monetization done in a way that allows for high profitability without preying on its actual community. These types of comparisons are numerous, and should some form of this bill end up anywhere near passing, they will be pressing questions and concerns that must be asked. But I cannot say that I have very much faith in the United States political system to ask those questions, largely governed by senators or representatives that are completely uneducated on this topic, who merely exist in a reactionary capacity to appease large demographics within their given voting blocks with the goal of building towards re-election or further advancement. But now we move on to a much more important analysis, the reason this bill is likely just smoke in the wind. Back when the whole loot box and microtransaction concept really kicked off, and not when it originated, which was many years prior, when it hit the mainstream spotlight, EA and Battlefront 2 were at the epicenter of the debate. The ball really got rolling from a regulatory perspective after EA crossed the line and made Battlefront 2 blatantly pay to win. At that time, the world was largely neutral, and looking at a relatively blank slate, it was easy to picture rolling waves of regulation that crippled the loot box concept and helped curb the downward industry spiral. Well, that's not what happened. When Belgium banned loot boxes, it was a major victory, yes, but the list of European countries that have found loot boxes to not be gambling is far, far longer. Ireland, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, just to name a few. I can't pretend to know the exact reasons why each of these countries opted to not declare loot boxes gambling. I would guess that it has something to do with a veritable army of lawyers and a string of complex investigations and negotiations, but the fact is they decided not to, and the prospect of a fledgling bill entering the turmoil-driven United States regulatory fighting pit and coming out as something that would cripple major US-based multi-billion-dollar companies? I mean, I get it, people want to be optimistic, but holy shit, that's a new level. Another area to really think about is economic ramifications. EA is just one company reliant on loot boxes, and believe me, they rely on them. I've heard people bitch and whine about how they shouldn't and didn't used to, so why should they now, with the expectation that if loot boxes were to be banned, nothing would happen. And that's mostly true, the first parts at least. They didn't in the past, and they certainly shouldn't now either, but the stone cold truth is that they do, and there will be huge ramifications if they were to be banned. One of EA's core franchises is FIFA, and FIFA relies on its Ultimate Team feature to provide constant cash flow in the form of loot boxes, or as they are called in the game itself, packs. In 2016, FIFA as an entire franchise accounted for roughly 40% of EA's revenue, and moving forward, the revenue growth for FIFA is expected to be even more consistent. I'm going to focus primarily on FIFA here, but keep in mind games like Apex Legends exist now as well, which rely fully on microtransactions since it is a free-to-play game, and EA has already raked in over $150 million in a few months since the game's release, and it's expected to earn $450 million in the current fiscal quarter, which would put it on track to account for a large chunk of EA's overall annual revenue, purely based on microtransactions and loot boxes. But back to FIFA. The in-game purchases for FIFA account for nearly $800 million in revenue annually, and among the list of countries in which Ultimate Team is available, the United States is second when it comes to overall revenue within the gaming market. But considering the emphasis within the Chinese market on mobile spending, and the fact that the Chinese internet-enabled population is over 3 times higher than the US, but the difference in revenue is only around 10%, it is a reasonable extrapolation that the US is by far the largest relevant gaming market for AAA video game consumption and loot box sales in the entire world. EA is also a California-based publisher that operates out of Redwood City, and in total employs over 9,000 people. Due to the nature of current US market expectations, which I have hashed and rehashed many a time in previous videos, EA and all companies like it have a fiduciary responsibility to increase profits year over year for their shareholders. When they fail to do so, share prices drop, very powerful people get very angry, and we have even seen that when large share price decreases happen, companies get investigated for fraud and any number of other infractions. When Bungie took Destiny and split from Activision Blizzard, an investigation started as a result of the sudden and massive decline, which was aimed at finding insider trading or exposing other instances of non-compliance. Activision Blizzard is another California-based company operating out of Santa Monica and employs about, give or take, 9,000 people. And I'll spare you all the dissection of revenue and relevant markets, but Activision Blizzard relies heavily on loot boxes through one of their core titles called Overwatch. Not to mention the fact that this bill is specifically designed taking aim at Candy Crush, which is also an Activision Blizzard mobile game title. Major US-based companies with billions and billions of dollars in annual revenue rely on loot boxes and flirt with the pay-to-win line in their video games. An actual ban on loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions would completely gut these companies to a point where tens of billions of dollars would be lost in market cap, and that kind of effect ripples outwards like a fucking boulder getting dropped in a lake. I want to say very explicitly that I want loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions to be gone. But when people understand how catastrophic it would be for major publishers, that thousands of people would lose their jobs, tens of thousands of others, more than that, much more than that, would lose massive amounts of money, hopefully it starts to make sense why the mere fact that a bill has been introduced means absolutely fuck all. We have seen this exact type of scenario before as well. A Hawaii representative named Chris Lee introduced, at the time, groundbreaking bills for the regulation of loot boxes. But both of those bills died in committee, which is the typical fate of a bill that lacks massive levels of special interest funding. I despise loot boxes, and I want to see pay-to-win microtransactions wiped away completely, but relying on US legislative bodies is irresponsible. Government regulation is like a bull in a china shop, or a sledgehammer trying to fix a watch. There was a time when I, like so many other YouTubers, would have made a video ranting about how this is a monumental thing, and the bill could change everything, and how the big game companies are about to have their reckoning, but I've learned a lot recently, and that's just not true. The same way we got to this point through gradual incremental steps forward is the same way we get back from it. I love video games. I want great games from quality companies, but throwing a stick of dynamite into the middle of all of it isn't the best approach, nor is it realistic to actually believe it will happen, least of all in the United States. What we need is constant consumer pressure. A wave of investigations across European countries helped, I guess, it really did, honestly, but the real driving force behind Battlefront 2 getting reworked was the fan base. EA was about to destroy the future of a beloved and unbelievably profitable franchise, and the fans forced them to change up the approach. If we as players can continue to apply pressure, we can motivate more companies to lean into the tactic of positive press, which creates a larger buyer's market and a typically emphatically supportive user base. Now, if the loot box ban were to pass, I would not be upset. Don't get me wrong, I would not be upset at all. But I also would not necessarily be happy. I would be nervous. A ban on loot boxes in essence is good because loot boxes are trash and shouldn't exist, but it would throw a wrench into a bunch of different franchises and games that I do love simply because they come from certain publishers. We have to think about ramifications. I know a lot of people saw the news and wanted to hear me rejoice like so many other YouTubers saying things like, they will finally get what they deserve, and it's been a long time coming. And truthfully, there was a time when that's a lot closer to what I'd be saying, but that's not the lay of the land. That's a shallow interpretation, and it simply isn't how I find myself viewing this chain of events. Loot boxes are trash, pay to win and microtransactions are garbage, but I don't know if a bunch of crusty old men in the United States government are the answer. That's it though. Probably not what a lot of people were expecting, but there it is. If you want to support the channel, there are links down below, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.